Is it time for the great breakaway? Hi, this is Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, there's a story in the Washington Times speaking about the secession fever that seems to have gripped people in a variety of states, from your own state of California to Oregon to Illinois to New York and even Virginia. Now, Bill, we haven't had a state split since 1863 when West Virginia became a state in its own right, but there are a number of places around the country where essentially for political and ideological reasons, people say, I want to have a state that's more like the way I think. And so, for example, they want to take part of Virginia and make it part of West Virginia. They want to break off Chicago and make it a state unto itself. Californians, as you well know, would like to split Northern and Southern, among other things. And all over the country where this is happening, Bill, the overriding reason seems to be that I am now in a state that does not think the way I do, for want of a better term, and therefore we should have the ability to break off this little hive of conservatives, for example, and make it part of a state that does, or make it its own state. Bill, is this the way to solve the problem of political division, by essentially playing it out geographically and dividing?
Well, before I get to that, it's important to look at why this might be happening. You know, we only had this issue come up in our history once before, where the fundamental issue was so important to people's lives and economies, and there was no room for compromise. There was either slavery in your state or there wasn't. That was it. And that's what basically caused the last split up of the Union. So you kind of have to ask yourself, in this world of prosperity, essentially tremendous, unprecedented levels of comfort and health and food supplies and all the rest of it, what is it that's causing that kind of impetus? And the only thing I can really think of is that politics has permeated every aspect of our lives. That this was not the case even as little as 20 years ago. That politics was not everything in your life. Politics didn't determine which restroom you used, and politics didn't determine who was going to win your high school daughter's track meet, and politics didn't determine any number of other things. They just determined national policy, and that might have adjusted the tax rate or whatever, but it didn't get into the absolute daily details of how to run your life, and that's basically what's happened. And this is the result of two political parties. One of them believes that government should be controlling everything, and one that believes the government should be controlling as little as possible and just do the things that only a government can do. So that's why we're in this situation. Nobody would be talking about leaving their home state if they disagreed with the rate of tariff on French imports. You know, but if somebody's telling you that your money's going to pay for abortion, or your schools are indoctrinating your children in sexual practices in second grade or so on, now all of a sudden this has risen to the level of actionable. So there are two ways out of this. We can either get politics out of our lives and return the country to a place where the differences between states are so minimal that this thing is no longer worth doing or discussing, or we can continue to politicize everything, at which point people are going to continue to say, I want to get the hell out of here. And just so you don't get the wrong impression, if there was one state that would leave the United States and become a country that was governed by the constitutional law according to as it's written, where the law was enforced, where private property was respected, where government was kept small, all of that stuff, I would give extraordinarily serious consideration to living in that place. Because this is not the country, not only this is not the country that it was designed to be, but this isn't the country that it was 20 or 30 years ago, and it seems to be getting worse all the time.
Bill, it seems to me that these divisions go deeper than political, or at least mirror some other kinds of divisions in the country. For example, when people in Northern California are talking about splitting away from Southern California, tends to be maybe a little more conservative to the north, a little more liberal to the south, and similar things happening in other areas of the country. It's not just political ideology, though. It's also urban versus suburban and rural. And so you've got those differences. The whole idea of having a federated republic for the United States of America, for example, was to essentially embrace the reality of these differences and come up with a system that would allow us to govern effectively on a wide-scale basis, even though we know there are going to be all kinds of different people. It's almost like people in rural areas, for example, are rejecting the idea that people in urban areas could have anything to say about how their lives should be lived, and vice
versa. Yeah. So let's take California, which everybody knows is the bluest state ideologically, and the one that's most not only susceptible to, but actually governed by far left ideas. Let's take a look at the bluest.
And may I add, Bill? Our podcast, which you can listen to on SoundCloud or Apple iTunes or Google Play or any of your podcast apps, the top 3 cities where our podcasts are being listened to are all in California.
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, so let's just take a blue California. And if you take a look at blue California, and instead of looking at it as a blue state in terms of how its electoral votes went, if you look at it on a county-by-county basis, it's dramatic. And if you look at it on a precinct-by-precinct basis, it's astonishing. California is a almost exclusively red state in terms of area. Obviously, it's the population centers of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and to some lesser degree, San Diego, that make California a blue state. And so people... You're absolutely right, Scott. You got it right on the nose. It's not a difference between slavery and non-slavery now. Now it's a question between urban. What's the word I'm really looking for here? Priorities versus non-urban priorities, because I don't think it's a question of cities versus farmers. I think it's a question of cities versus suburbs and so on and so forth. I live in a suburb of Los Angeles. I don't consider myself to be a city dweller, believe it or not. I really don't. I live in a very just lots and lots of trees, and I go walking at 2 o'clock in the morning wherever I want to, and then I have to look around to find a building that's taller than 2 stories tall. So,
and yet your area is still a relatively heavily populated area. It's just not stacked high.
So clearly I live in Los Angeles, which is clearly a large city, but at the same time, I don't feel like a city dweller to that degree. Otherwise I wouldn't live here. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that the values of the city are things like control of population movement, public health care, public sanitation, much deeper government intrusion into day-to-day life outside of your door.
In many ways of necessity.
Well, of course. If you live in a city, the difference from your front door to the next person's front door is 4 feet. If you live in the country, it's often 4 miles. And so when you have people packed that closely together, the common area of your life becomes much more dominant than the private area of your life, and this is where all of the troubles are. So city governments, the kind of people that have wanted to run city governments, have always pretty much been the same. And Tammany Hall is a great example of this. You could look at, if you look at New York City in the 1840s, it would appear to be nothing but rural to you, obviously. I mean, there's nothing but horses and there's oil lanterns and it is 1840 New York is as rural as you could get in America today. But in 1840 New York, Tammany Hall had already become the model of city-type governance. It was power concentrated in the hands of one or two particularly tough people. It was heavily subsidized by paybacks and unions, and all of the stuff that happens when you have concentrations of people living together was enforced by thugs, and it was mostly powered by the fact that a few prominent people were known to everybody, but the millions of people that were actually carrying the burden in terms of taxes and making things happen were completely anonymous to one another. You simply didn't know who they were. That's why city crime rates are so high. Somebody mugs you in New York City, they disappear into the crowd, you never see them again. Somebody mugs you in Mayberry, you'll probably see them at church on Sunday. So all of these differences are profound and getting more profound, and this is why the country seems to be coming apart, because the Democrats' model is a model of urban governance, strict control over the population and everything that they do, including things like surveillance and including things like mandates for what you would call, let's say, public health services or so on. This is what you have to do when you have millions of people living on top of each other.
And Bill, just taking that, what you just said, I think, there is a tendency of people who are on the conservative side of life or the Republican side to look askance at the way the Democrats are running things because of the kind of description you just gave, instead of looking at it and saying, well, by its very nature, if you're governing in the population centers, you have a different perspective. The Constitution, when it was written, and then, over the next couple of years when it was ratified in 1787, Philadelphia, where they drafted the Constitution, had a population in the area of about 40,000 people, soon to be overtaken by New York City, but at that point was the biggest city in the United States of America. One wonders, Bill, whether the framers could have even grasped the concept of population density centers like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. In a way, could they have taken that into account and said, man, we're going to have, most of our people are going to be living in areas that have a completely different way of life and are much more codependent than people who are in the hinterlands. It almost makes one wonder whether the Constitution needs a refresh based on the way the population has played out.
I'm never, ever, let me rephrase that. I won't say I never, ever, but I will say that I have never, ever heard any case that compelled me to think that there was an error in the Constitution that needed to be addressed. Almost always, it's stuff that happened after the Constitution was written. And as we get into history, which is why it's useful to know history, what we find is that all of these things that are causing people to want to split up now are a result of laws passed, including and especially the constitutional amendments that were passed during the progressive period, which for those of you who might be progressives out there, actually was better part of 130, 140 years old now, this progressive movement. But this was the era of income tax. It was the era of prohibition. It was the era of eliminating the Senate as a house of the states and just basically turning it into a House of Lords so that the population centers would have even more control over the entire area. And now we're down to the brass tacks of it. If you look at California as an example, your example is exactly right. In Philadelphia, there might be 40,000 people. If you put a pin in the center of Philadelphia in 1776 or 1783 or 87, whatever you want, you put a pin in the center of Philadelphia and say, inside this radius is 40,000 people. How far outside of that radius would you have to go to get to 40,000 people that weren't inside the city center? Wouldn't be a huge radius. If you take a city center like Los Angeles with, I don't even know what it is anymore, 12, 15 million people. You put a pin there and say, inside the circle is 15 million people. How far do you have to draw that circle to get another 15 million? Well, it turns out you have to draw it to Oregon or Utah. So as the populations continue to concentrate into the cities, the representation of the cities grows. And then that means that people in places like Sacramento, which is neither a city or the country really when you get right down to it, are elected by people in the cities and enforce urban morality, urban values, and urban laws upon people that don't wish to live under those kind of laws, because if they did, they'd move to the cities. So here's where the problem is. You do not see an awful lot of country people agitating to have country values emplaced in the cities. You don't often see, in fact, I'm pretty sure I've never seen farmers gathering together in order to protest the fact that inner city schools are not teaching enough Bible studies. What you find, on the other hand, is that the people who have been attracted to power, we come right back to Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall and all the rest of these miserable, reprehensible representatives, these people who have to have power and have to tell other people what to do. As the urban centers become more and more and more concentrated, their political power grows, their radius of power grows, and they pull more and more people that want nothing to do with these values under their yoke because they cannot leave people alone. They cannot.
Should we let those concentrated population areas split off and essentially say, you know what, Los Angeles and the rest of Southern California, you're going to get a couple of senators, but you're not going to poison the senatorial well of Northern California. You're going to be the 51st state. You're going to have your own 2 senators and protect Northern California from that kind of influence. What does that accomplish?
Well, now we're on to the real problem here. The last time we had this kind of crisis, there was, in fact, a line. And it doesn't mean that every single person north of the Mason-Dixon line was an abolitionist and every single person south was a slaveholder or supported slavery. Most people in the South, as most people know, never actually owned slaves. But there was a line. South of this line is slavery. North of this line is our free states. And so when that political issue came to a head, you were able to separate out the 2 combatants. Most of the anti-slavery people, the vast majority of them already lived in the North, and the vast majority of the pro-slavery people already lived in the South. And when the Civil War came, there was some crossing of the border. People who were anti-slavery politically, but decided to live in southern states. Once the Civil War started, they moved north, the other ones moved south, and so on. How do you do that today? If the conflict, as you point out, I think you're absolutely right. If the balance is destroyed between city values and non-city values, how the hell do you do that? It's not like you could say east of the Mississippi or west of the Mississippi. You can't even say northern or southern California. You're really talking about, in order to isolate this politically, the way that slavery isolated that issue geographically, in order to take today's political differences and geographically separate them, you kind of have to cut the cities out of the country and make the cities their own country and make the stuff that's not cities its own country. And how the hell do you do that?
Well, and let me make this the final question, because I said that there are multiple layers of this. So it's not just political. It gets into that urban, ex-urban divide. But in addition, Bill, as you've kind of indicated there, it also gets into a racial divide because of the high concentration, for example, of African Americans or even recent immigrants in population-dense areas like Los Angeles or New York. Then you wind up not just breaking off a population center, you wind up breaking off huge chunks of racial minorities and ethnic minorities to be part of those. And doesn't that create its own sort of unnecessary division, something that most Americans don't desire to see us, divided along racial lines?
Well, I mean, let's really get down to brass tacks here. We're not divided along racial lines. We're divided along political lines. And it is the policy of the Democrats to buy the votes of minorities by offering them free stuff in exchange for their votes. That's basically the deal.
And I would go beyond that, Bill, because I think sometimes that makes it sound like all racial minorities are on the dole.
Well, clearly they're not. No.
There are also high concentrations because the government was the first to basically start integrating the workforce.
Yes,
there are
that's right.
A disproportionate number
in
of African Americans who work for government because they could a generation or two ago, whereas they were prevented from working in other kinds of professions. And so it's not just people on the dole, it's a lot of people who have an investment in the sustenance of the kind of government that the Democrats wish to keep going.
But my point is, let's just say, to make this clear, let's just say that a race of super aliens comes along and takes all the Republicans and Democratic senators, congressmen, take all parties off to the moon, and there's no parties left. And then a group of winged angels come down and decide to rule society. If these people if you were to take away all of the existing political structure and have a new political structure that was dedicated to everybody having the best possible lives for themselves, then the state of dependency that exists inside the urban centers would be destroyed for the good of the people that live inside the urban centers. There would be programs to get them jobs, and there would be means of bringing people into the community to bring jobs, and there would be law enforcement inside those communities for jobs so that businesses could grow. And you would find that there wouldn't be any racial divisions anymore because you're no longer holding entire populations hostage by the ideology of racism. That's what you would find. So it's not so much a racial divide as it's a political divide, and that political divide is what is poisoning the country right now.
That still doesn't deal with the issue of proportionally higher numbers of African Americans, for example, working in government. So they're slitting their own throats if they vote for the party that wants smaller government.
There is government. You can't have government if you were to take the country divided into red and blue. It doesn't mean there's no government in the red. And furthermore, while it is absolutely true, the point you made that especially at the beginning of the Civil War, then going on through Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all the rest, that the government was generally speaking hiring more blacks than private businesses were, certainly in the South. That's fine, but that's 1910. That's 1920. That certainly no longer applies today. There's no reason today why black people have to be employed by the government more than they have to be in private sector. It's got nothing to do with that. What's happening is the Democratic Party is telling black Americans that they are being kept down by racist, rich, white Republicans, and that's why they have to live in these murder pits with 8,000 of them being killed a year. That's the dynamic.
That makes it sound like that African Americans are so naive that they believe this patently obvious lie.
It's not that they're naive, Scott. It's all they know. How would they? And when I say it's all they know, how would they know any different? How would they know differently? What possible thing do you think could change that? I bet you anything if you went to an inner city, I don't have to bet you, I've already seen this done on the street. If you went to an inner city school in any American school district today and asked whether Abraham Lincoln was a Republican or a Democrat, 95% of the people in that school would say a Democrat. How are they going to know? What can they possibly know? It's not a question of their ability or intelligence, nothing. It's that they have been told this lie for well over 100 years now, and they continue to believe it, except that finally, it's starting to dawn on some black Americans that this whole thing may in fact be a giant con game. And right now it's still just a pretty slim edge, but when you listen to black conservatives talk, when you listen to people like Alfonso Rachel and Owens and all the rest of them, what you find consistently in their personal stories is the shock that they experienced once they got outside of that bubble and discovered what was actually going on out there. So I just have a major problem saying that this is a racial issue. It's not a racial issue. It's a political strategy. And if the people in the cities would just mind their own damn business and just say, we're going to govern the city the way we want to govern the city, fine, but leave the rest of the state alone, then we'd have no problems. But that's not how they work. So look, finally, the final thing is this. There is always and continues to be the option of voting with your feet, right? I'm in California right now, which is antithetical to my values because I feel like I need to be here and I like it here. And when it becomes intolerable for me to be here, I'll leave. But the problem with the voting with your feet thing, which used to be so effective in the history of this country, if you don't like the morality in Mississippi, then move to San Francisco. Okay. But as politics becomes more and more divisive, and especially, this is really the fundamental dynamic, and as politics moves ever higher up the level. In other words, if you had local politics in Mississippi and local politics in San Francisco, and Biloxi and San Francisco were running their cities, just the cities, you'd have no problem. If you didn't like it in Biloxi, you go to San Francisco. Didn't like it in San Francisco, you go to Biloxi. That's fine. That's how it's supposed to work. But as the political power continues to move up so that it's no longer Biloxi, now it's San Francisco controlling the whole state of California. Now California is controlling the entire United States of America through this level of influence they have from their population base. Now you find that the people in Biloxi are beholden to the people in San Francisco in areas that they never were before, or vice versa. And this is where the problem is. The problem is if you were to really get down to the problem is that the valves that contain local differences of opinion to local governance have been leaking and have now essentially burst. And the ability for a region to maintain a regional government that's different than another regional government isn't working anymore, because in both cases, all of that power is flowing uphill and it's going to meet in the top. And then it's a battle of the vote. And whichever side wins then puts its philosophy down on everybody else again. And now we all have to live according to other people's rules. And that's why you're feeling this kind of angst and why you're seeing these kind of movements. And I think the only solution to do it and keep the United States as a nation is to put power down to the local level and keep it there. And if you don't like it in San Francisco, move someplace else. And if you don't like it in Biloxi, move someplace else. But if you can't move away from San Francisco, in other words, if I move out of San Francisco and I move to Stockton and San Francisco follows me there, which is exactly the case, now we got a problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com, who contribute on a monthly and annual basis to making sure that these messages get out around the world. We're grateful to them, and we ask you to join them right now by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.